Okay. Yeah, there's a bottle of water. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started as people get their water and settle in. Tonight we're going to get started in the book of Daniel. Daniel is the last book in the Old Testament, and Daniel is pretty unique. I don't want to say strange, but it's unique, and among the books of the Old Testament, it has kind of an odd history. It is different in a lot of respects than all the other books of the Old Testament. And we're going to, in the introduction tonight, we'll be getting into a lot of why. Before I get started on Daniel, did anybody have any questions or anything left over from before? Or general questions or insults they wanted to hurl? Or
you pretty well covered.
Okay. So Daniel, one of the things that's interesting about the book of Daniel, we've only seen, as you may remember, Daniel referred to, the person Daniel, referred to in one other place of the Old Testament, and that is in Ezekiel. And when I say only one other place in the Old Testament, I'm including, for example, some of the books that we have in the Orthodox Old Testament that aren't necessarily in everybody's Old Testament. He's not mentioned in the books of the Maccabees. He's not mentioned in Ben Sirach. He's not mentioned in Wisdom of Solomon. Okay, so Daniel is sort of barely mentioned. And when he is mentioned in Ezekiel, remember he's mentioned along with Job and Moses. So because of this, there is now an interesting theory among scholars and our friends at the History Channel, which is basically that the person we're about to read about didn't exist. It usually starts that way, right? There was no day, and well, here's where they say they got the name. Several decades ago, archaeologists discovered a city called Ugarit. Okay. Ugarit. They discovered the remains of this ancient city. And Ugarit was at its prime around 1100, 1200 BC. And it was pretty close to where Israel and Judah were. And the language they spoke, Ugaritic, was very close to Hebrew. And so this was an important archaeological find because there were a lot of, especially the older parts of the Old Testament, there were a lot of these archaic Hebrew words that literally, until that point, scholars, even Jewish scholars, rabbinical scholars, didn't know exactly what the word meant. They weren't sure. They would have kind of a guess based on the context, well, it must mean something like this, but they weren't totally sure until we made this archaeological find. Then all of a sudden, we'd have a word that was used only once in the whole Old Testament, but we found all kinds of tablets there where in Ugaritic that word was used 20 or 30 other times, and we could figure out what it meant. Right? So this was an important archaeological find for Old Testament studies. In one of the documents that they've translated, there is a reference to a sort of folk hero type character who would have lived around 1100 BC, whose name was Dan-el. So, get ready for it. Based only on that, the current theory among many scholars is that Daniel never existed, and they took the name of this folk hero from 1100 years ago in Ugarit and just slapped it on a made-up person and made up these stories. Like 900 years later. Right? And that's the sum total of the evidence they have to base that on. I say that just because if you sit down to watch a History Channel documentary about the book of Daniel, you're liable to get it. And they won't say, as I just did, that scholars have a theory. They'll say, Daniel never existed. In fact, he's named after an ancient Ugaritic folk hero, right? They'll just say that like it's a fact, like they have some evidence behind that, other than the coincidence of the two of them having a similar name, right? So, that said, when we get to the book of Daniel, as I said, it's kind of interesting or strange in a few regards, because the book of Daniel, I talked before about with Isaiah, with Jeremiah, with Ezekiel, how a lot of the prophetic books in the Old Testament seem to have been put together from other collections. Right? So someone will put together a collection of a prophet's sayings, right? And then someone else will put together a collection of the prophet's sayings. Then a third person will put both of those collections together, right? And they sort of collect them and order them and edit them together into one big book. Well, with Daniel, the stories, what are now the chapters, very conveniently, they put the chapter divisions in pretty much the right places. What are now the chapters actually represent individual stories about Daniel. And they're not put together in order. You'll see as we go through, they bounce around. Each one tells you when it takes place at the beginning, right? But they don't take place in order. And they seem to have been collected at different times. Okay. One other thing leading into this, before I go further into that, is as we've seen, almost every other book, with the exception of the Wisdom of Solomon that was written directly in Greek, every other book we've read was originally in Hebrew, right? And then later was translated into other languages. Daniel is an exception. Daniel is an exception. And it's a huge exception because it's in the Hebrew canon. If you go and get a Hebrew Bible, right, from a Jewish synagogue, Daniel's in their Bible. Okay? But Daniel wasn't written in Hebrew. The central part of Daniel, there are 12 chapters, and there's even more to say about that, but there's 12 chapters, and chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. Not there are Aramaic words in them. They're written entirely in the language Aramaic. They're in a different language. Okay. Chapters 2 through 7. Okay. And even chapters 2 through 7 in Aramaic, as I said, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are 5 different stories. They're really independent story units. Right? There are 5 different stories. And then 7 is an apocalyptic vision. So it's an entirely different thing. Right? So even these pieces that were all in Aramaic look like they may have originally been separate pieces that someone collected together and wrote down in Aramaic. In regards to that, as I said, chapter 7 is an apocalyptic vision, sort of like we saw toward the end of the book of Ezekiel, his visions. In terms of the whole book, as we have it now, chapters 1 through 6 are stories. 1 through 6 are stories. Chapters 7 through 12, the rest of the book, this is apocalyptic visions and prophecies. So there are 2 different sort of genres of literature here put together too. So as we're reading through, when we get to the end of 6 and start 7, there's going to be a big shift in terms of the whole type of what we're reading. It's going to become something different. Okay. It is probably the case that the version that's in the Hebrew Bible, I can't say the Hebrew version because most of it's Aramaic. The version that's in the Hebrew Bible, which has chapter 1 in Hebrew, 2 through 7 in Aramaic, and 8 through 12 in Hebrew. That version was put together sometime at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. So you're looking at probably the 180s or 190s. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, we read the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, and in the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, remember, he went through all the other books of the Old Testament. He doesn't mention Daniel. So the version that became accepted probably was not available to him, which tells us it was probably put together. Now, I'm not saying somebody sat down and wrote it in 180, right? Because as I've already said, there are already separate pieces here, right? I'm saying around 180, someone took 2 through 7 in Aramaic that probably already existed. Probably added, as we'll see when we read chapter 1. Chapter 1 is sort of a prologue. Sort of tells you who everybody is and when this is happening. So probably added chapter 1 and then collected chapters 8 through 12, which also seem to have existed already, and just put them together around 180. Because, I'm, of course, biased because I think Daniel was a real person who actually lived and did these things. So these things go back to Daniel, but the book gets written down and put together really late. Okay. Now I'm going to throw another monkey wrench in. As if that wasn't enough. In the Greek versions, and notice I said versions plural. In the Greek versions of the book of Daniel, of which there are actually 4, but there's only 2 that are important. In the Greek versions of Daniel, in addition to these 12 chapters, okay, there are 2 more stories. The story of Susanna, the story of Bel and the dragon, and then one extension of a story. One big added chunk to one of the stories that was already there, that comes in the middle of chapter 3, that aren't in the Hebrew and Aramaic version. And that, as far as we can tell, aren't translations. Meaning they were written in Greek. The first Greek translation of Daniel seems to have taken place, or the first Greek version of Daniel seems to have been done around 200 BC. Now you may know, Father Stephen, that's 20 years before you just suggested that the Hebrew version. And you're right. I am suggesting it seems that this is called Theodosian's translation. I won't write out his name, but this is called Theodosian's translation of Daniel, or his recension is the fancy word, but his version of Daniel does seem to predate the collection that's in the Hebrew Bible. The other version, when I said there are Greek versions, the other version is the Septuagint version. The Septuagint version was actually done around 100 BC. It was actually much later that the Septuagint version of Daniel was done. And, again, I said Daniel was strange. In Orthodox Bibles, any copy of the Septuagint that we've found after the year 250 AD Okay, so after 250 AD, all the physical Bibles we found of the Old Testament in Greek do not have the Septuagint translation of Daniel in them. They have Theodosian's version of Daniel in them. All the other books are from the Septuagint. Daniel is Theodosian's version. And between 200 BC and 250 AD, there are only two that have the Septuagint version that we found. So for whatever reason, right, the starting of the early church and then going forward, the church picked this version done by Theodosian in 200 BC of Daniel to be the one that it liked best, which includes the 12 chapters and includes these 3 editions. And the way it's put together is you have the story of Susanna, and then chapters 1 through 12, then Bel and the Dragon at the end, right? And then this edition is in the middle of chapter 3. So this is why, when we start reading out of the Orthodox Study Bible, you'll see at the beginning of the book it just says Susanna. It doesn't say chapter 1. Right? It says Susanna. And then if you turn the page, all of a sudden you get to chapter 1. And you're like, well, wait. Right? What was that if it wasn't chapter 1? Right? Well, that's what it was. It's this additional story. Okay, and when we get to the end, when we finish chapter 12, we're going to run into Bel and the Dragon. And I'll make a note of it when we get there in chapter 3. We'll run into the Song of the Three Youths, which is sort of put there in the middle. So basically, to boil all that down, right? The takeaway from that is that the Orthodox Church. And I should add, when St. Jerome translated the Vulgate, he did it from Theodosian's version also. So it's not just the church, East and West. So the church, the book of Daniel came together very late compared to the other books of the Old Testament. Right? We're talking about between 200 and 180 BC that this got all pulled together and edited together into its current form. Very late. There were multiple versions, right, that came together at that time in different languages. This version itself is in 2 different languages. In multiple languages, the church chose this particular Greek compilation to be the one that it was going to use. Okay? To be the one that it was going to use. Now, you may ask then, if that's true about the church, why is this version in most of the Bibles I would buy today? Like the 1611 King James is actually from this one. But if you get a modern King James one, it has the shorter version of Daniel. That's because, frankly, it was mostly an accident of history. The Protestant reformers, when Luther and Calvin and the others were attempting to make translations of the Bible into the vernacular at their time, so Luther's translating into German, you have Calvin translating the Bible into French, right, and the other reformers translating the Bible into English and into Spanish and into other vernacular languages. They had, because Constantinople had fallen and Christian refugees from Greece had swarmed into Europe, they had copies of the New Testament. Right? They had their gospel books and their epistle books from their churches that were overrun by the Turks. So they brought them with them. And so they were able to get back behind the Latin at that point in the Middle Ages had become very corrupted, the Latin text, pretty far from the original. So they were able to go with the New Testament. They said, okay, well, we can go back to the original Greek here. Right? And that'll give us a better idea of what it said. Well, the Orthodox Church, as you may have noticed, we don't have Old Testament readings every Sunday. Or every day of the week. Right? And so those refugees didn't have complete Septuagint texts for them to even look at. Okay? So for them to try to get back at the original, what did they have available to them? Well, there were Jews in Europe. Yeah, there were Jews in Europe, and they had their Bibles. Right? So they said, well, this is obviously much older than the Latin, right? It goes to the original, and so they went back to those Hebrew texts because they were the oldest and best texts they had available to them at the time. Right? Now we've done a lot more archaeology. We found Ugarit. Right? We've done a lot more research. We have a lot more historical texts available to us than they did. Right? And so now, we can, for example, figure this out about Theodosian's text, right? The Theodosian's text isn't some weird translation that came later than this one that added a bunch of stuff, right? But it's a different collection that was put together at around the same time, probably even a little earlier. And so we can make sort of better conclusions based on having more evidence to help our understanding. So I wouldn't, so much put down the Reformers as wrong. It's just, they're doing the best they could with what they had to work with. But we shouldn't stick with that, right? We shouldn't stubbornly say, no, I want to stay at a 16th century level of knowledge of biblical criticism. So now that we know more. Let's take advantage of it. Okay. So all that is by way of introduction. Does anybody have any questions about that before we get going? Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started here. One last note, as we're going to see, a lot of this is going to come out as we start reading. Daniel, like Ezekiel, is one of those people of Judah who's taken in the second deportation. Daniel is very, very young when he's taken. Probably because it says that he's a young man. Remember, you becoming a man 12, 13 years old. So he's probably an early teenager when he's taken into Babylon in that second deportation. So he's going to be in Babylon under 4 kings and 2 different empires. Right? He's going to be taken under Nebuchadnezzar II, and we're going to see him interact with Nebuchadnezzar II, with Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar. Right? He's going to be there when Cyrus conquers the Babylonian Empire and establishes the Persian Empire. And he's going to be there under Darius, who is not Cyrus's immediate heir. Cyrus has a son who's in power for a very short period of time, who most people think Darius assassinated. But Darius ends up taking power. And so he's the last king we'll see. And Darius came to the throne around 530 BC. So when we read those stories about Daniel, which is when a lot of these apocalyptic prophecies happen and when the last couple of these stories happen, Daniel at that point is probably at least in his 70s, maybe his 80s. So this first story we're going to read, the story of Susanna, starts before he's taken, right, when he's a little kid. So I'm trying to get the span here. It's going to go from when he's a little kid to when he is a very elderly man. And he's going to take place over the course of his whole life, most of which is going to be lived in the city of Babylon. And one last note here. As we're going to see, I mentioned the reason Ezekiel was taken was that he could read and write. That also seems to be the primary reason Daniel and his friends, who we'll talk about in a minute, were taken. When they're taken, as we'll see, they're all given new names by Nebuchadnezzar. And that's part of the sort of trend. You're not people of Judah anymore. you have a new name, you're a new person here now, you work for me kind of thing. And not only that, but all the names they start out with, for example, Daniel means God is my judge. All the names they start with, and we'll talk about his friends too, involve the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, God of Judah in them. All the names that they're given by Nebuchadnezzar involve different pagan Babylonian gods. Daniel's given the name Belteshazzar, which means roughly Bel, remember, is the Babylonian name for the god Baal or Baal. Belteshazzar means guardian of the treasure of Baal. Okay. And you may wonder, why would he name him guardian of the treasure of Baal? Well, remember, Nebuchadnezzar's son here, who's going to become the emperor, who's going to be the last emperor of the Babylonian Empire, his name is Belshazzar, which means treasure of Baal. Right. So, this is a clue as to specifically why Daniel was taken. Daniel was taken to serve as a tutor and teacher for Nebuchadnezzar's son. Right? Help raise Nebuchadnezzar's son. Teach him to read, teach him to write. Prepare him. And we'll see as we go that he keeps talking about Daniel having this really high position in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Well, this is why. Right? This is because he's essentially the tutor helping raise his son and heir.
At the age of 30.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see here in the story of Susanna right off the bat, Daniel was a very smart guy from a very early age. He's going to become renowned very quickly for his wisdom and knowledge. So. Okay, so let's start here in Susanna. Chapter 0, I guess. There was a man living in Babylon, and his name was Jehoiakim. He took a wife whose name was Susanna, the daughter of Hilkiah, a very beautiful woman and one who feared the Lord. Her parents were righteous and taught their daughter according to the law of Moses. Jehoiakim was exceedingly wealthy, with a spacious garden adjoining his house. And the Jews came to him because he was the most honored of them all. In that year, 2 elders from the people were appointed as judges, concerning whom the Lord said, "Lawlessness came forth out of Babylon, from the elders who were judges, who were supposed to govern the people." These men were frequently at Jehoiakim's house, and all who had judgments came to them. Okay, so they're living in Babylon, meaning this is part of the deportee community. And despite the fact that they're now living in Babylon, they're still trying to function, right? They're still trying to function as a community. We're going to see part of that is going to be that they're trying to maintain, for example, following the food laws, the rules about cleanliness and uncleanliness from the law, from the Mosaic law. They can't offer sacrifices, they don't have a temple. But they're trying to keep the other cultural laws, right? To try and keep their sense of community and culture alive. So we have one man who's done well in Babylon here, Jehoiakim, not to be confused with the king. Jehoiakim, and he's wealthy, he's got this wife. The people come and hang out at his expansive property, and there are elders among the people, and so the people, when there's disputes between one Judahite and another, rather than getting involved in Babylonian law courts, right, they take it to the elders of their people. Right? So that's who these 2 judges are. These 2 judges are 2 older members of the community who, when people have a dispute, they come to them to hear it out and settle it. And as we're told here, these 2 are not very good at it, or they're doing it in the wrong way, right? They're favoring certain people over others. So verse 7, "Now when the people departed at midday, Susanna would go into her husband's garden to walk. So the 2 elders would see her going in and walking about every day, and they desired her. They turned away their heart and averted their eyes from looking to heaven. and from remembering righteous judgments. Both were pierced to the heart for her, but they did not tell each other their pain. They were ashamed to inform one another of their desire, because they wished to have relations with her. So every day they eagerly watched to see her. Finally they said to one another, "Let us go home, for it is time for the midday meal." And going out they parted from each other. But turning back they met again, and when they pressured each other for the reason, they confessed their desire. Together they arranged for a time when they could find her alone. Okay, so the two of them like to start lingering around, right? When Jehoiakim's wife comes out to walk in the garden, got to watch her. First, they won't admit to each other why they're doing it because they're embarrassed. Then they kind of catch each other trying to sneak back after they left to go eat lunch. And so they admit what they're up to. Verse 15, then it came to pass while they were waiting for an opportune day, she went in as before with only 2 maids. She also wished to bathe in the garden, for it was hot. For no one was there except the 2 elders who hid themselves and were watching her. She said to her maids, "Bring me oil and ointments and shut the doors of the garden that I may bathe." They did as she said and closed the garden doors. They went out by the side doors to bring the things commanded, but did not see the elders because they were hidden. When the maids left, the 2 elders arose and ran to her and said, "Look, the doors of the garden are closed and no one will see us, and we desire you. Therefore give us your consent and lie with us. If you do not, we will testify that a young man was with you, and because of this you sent your maids away from you." Then Susanna sighed deeply and said, "I am hemmed in on all sides, for if I do this thing, it is death for me. And if I do not, I will not escape your hands. But it is better for me not to do it and fall into your hands than to sin against the Lord." Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice, and the 2 elders cried out against her. One of them ran and opened the garden doors. When the household servants heard the cry in the garden, they rushed in by the side doors to see what had happened to her. So when the elders told their tale, the servants were deeply ashamed, for such a report had never been made about Susanna. So the 2 of them corner her by herself, try and get her to sleep with them, right? And tell her basically, if you don't, we're going to lie and say you were in here having an affair and we caught you, right? So she says, "No way," right? After acknowledging the position she's in, right? Because she's a woman, right? Which means she doesn't have standing in court. She has no witnesses she could call. She's got 2 witnesses against her. And remember, it only takes 2 to condemn people. So if they make up and they tell the same story, right? And if she's convicted of adultery, that's the death penalty, right? That's the death penalty here in Babylon, right? But no, she decides she'd rather risk it, getting executed, than fall into sin by agreeing to what they want to do. So verse 28. Then it came to pass the next day, when the people assembled at the house of Jehoiakim her husband, the 2 elders also came, full of their lawless purpose against Susanna, to have her put to death. They said before all the people, "Send for Susanna, the daughter of Hilkiah, who is the wife of Jehoiakim." So they sent for her, and she came with her parents, her children, and all her kindred. Now Susanna was very desirable and beautiful to behold. However, she was veiled. Thus the lawless men commanded she be unveiled so as to enjoy her beauty. But her friends and all who saw her wept. And the 2 elders arose in the midst of the people and laid their hands upon her head. She wept and looked up to heaven, for her heart trusted in the Lord. The 2 elders said, "As we were walking in the garden alone, this woman came in with 2 maids, closed the door of the garden, and dismissed the maids. Then a young man who was hidden came to her and lay with her. Now we were in a corner of the garden and saw this lawlessness. So we ran to them and saw them having relations. But we could not hold the man, for he was stronger than we. He then opened the doors and rushed out. So we seized this woman and asked her who the young man was, but she was unwilling to tell us. Thus the assembly believed them, as they were elders and judges among the people. So they condemned her to death." Okay, so she does what she can, right? She brings her family, she brings her children, hoping that maybe these 2 guys aren't that evil, right? Maybe they'll have some pity on her, for the sake of her children, for the sake of her family, right? Who obviously know what's coming since they're weeping, right? But these 2 guys have none. Verse 42, but Susanna cried out with a loud voice and said, O eternal God, who know both what is secret and all things before they come to be, you know these men testified against me falsely, and behold, I shall die, though I did none of the things they wickedly invented against me. The Lord heard her voice, and as she was being led away to be put to death, God aroused the Holy Spirit of a young boy whose name was Daniel. So, you may have been wondering, when's Daniel going to show up? Well, here he is. Here he is. So God hears her prayer and sends Daniel. He cried out with a loud voice, I am innocent of the blood of this woman. So all the people turned to him and said, What is this thing you said? Then he stood in their midst and said, Are you such fools, O sons of Israel? Without examination or knowledge of the evidence, have you condemned a daughter of Israel? Return to the place of judgment, for these men testified against her falsely. Now, you have an idea of just how bold this is, right? Because you've got a lynch mob together, right? Dragging this woman out to kill her on the testimony of these two elderly and respected men, right? And this kid, Daniel, pops up, right? And says, I'm innocent of the blood. I want nothing to do with this, right? And they all look at him like, who are you? And how does he respond? Right, he calls them fools. Right? These you fools are about to go. You didn't even examine the evidence. This kid, right? You didn't even examine the evidence. Right? Verse 50, so all the people returned with haste. The elders said to him, Come sit in our midst and inform us, for God gives you that privilege. Daniel then said to them, Separate them far from each other, and I will examine them. All right, so he has them separate the two judges. When they were separated from each other, he summoned one of them and said to him, You old man of evil days, now the sins you committed in earlier days have come home. For you pronounce unjust judgments, condemn the innocent, and set the guilty free. Yet the Lord said, You shall not kill the innocent and the righteous. Now then, if indeed you saw her, tell me, under which tree did you see them being intimate with each other? Okay. So notice, he doesn't even start out pretending to play nice. He starts out, listen, you lying old deceitful, right? Evil man. Yeah, what tree were they doing this act under? Okay. He replies, under a mastic tree. Daniel then said, Plainly you lied against your own head, for even now the angel of God receives the sentence from God, and he shall cut you in two. Then he removed him and commanded them to bring the other. He said to him, You seed of Canaan and not of Judah. Beauty deceived you, and desire turned away your heart. This is how both of you deal with the daughters of Israel. And they have been intimate with you through fear. But a daughter of Judah would not endure your lawlessness. Now then tell me, under what tree did you catch them being intimate with each other? He replied, Under the evergreen oak. Daniel said to him, Plainly you also lied against your own head. For the angel of God is waiting with his sword to cut you in two, that he may destroy both of you. Then the whole assembly cried out with a loud voice and blessed God, who saves those who hope in him. So they rose up against the two elders, for Daniel convicted them out of their own mouth of bearing false witness. And they did to them the thing they maliciously intended to do against their neighbor. For acting in accordance with the law of Moses, they put them to death. Therefore innocent blood was saved on that day. Hilkiah and his wife praised God for their daughter, with Jehoiakim her husband and all her kindred, because nothing shameful was found in her. Thus Daniel had a great reputation among the people from that day onward. Okay, so that's our first extra story about Daniel, which is set up here as the way to introduce Daniel to us. Right? Set up as the way to introduce Daniel to us. And there's already some themes here from the book. Right? One of the themes is what Susanna did. The fact that the people of Judah, now that they're in Babylon, are going to be constantly called upon to try and compromise, right? Try and compromise the law of God. And they're going to have to decide, in many cases, as we're going to see some more cases as we go through the book, between sinning and death, literally. right? Just like she did, right? But that's going to be a real option in their life. And they're going to have to choose to follow the Lord, even if it means their death, and trust that God is going to be there to deliver them. Right? So that's going to be one of the main themes of the book that's already brought out here. Another one, obviously, is going to be that Daniel is a person, in this case, during this period of time, the person who God is kind of using as his agent and his representative in Babylon. We're going to see Daniel's going to have a lot of interaction. It's not just that he sort of hangs around near these kings. He's going to have a lot of interaction with Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius in particular, those three. And most of the time when he's interacting with them, he's going to be coming to them on behalf of God with something God wants to say to them. Right? So he is sort of God, the ambassador from God to Babylon right? during the period of his life. And so then you also see the theme, as we said, of him having this wisdom that sort of surpasses his age, even from his youth. Right? And a lot of the church fathers draw a connection between this story of Susanna and the story of Christ. The one story we get of Christ in his teenage years, when he stayed in the temple as his parents started to travel home, and they find him sitting with the teachers of the law, sort of teaching and correcting them, and everyone sort of marvels at how could he talk this way at that age, right? That's sort of a reminiscence of this story. The idea, the reason why Daniel could do that is because God had placed His Holy Spirit in him.
Is he also a type of Pilate?
It is.
Innocent of this man's blood.
With Pilate, there's a little bit of a different thing going on. But we'll get there sometime beginning of next year, probably. In Matthew. Yeah.
He said that he was taken to Babylon during the second
Yeah.
plague
Yeah.
because of his people being able to read.
Right.
Okay, so here in the background part of Daniel here, it says Daniel was born in the tribe of Judah and was taken to Babylon and captivity as an infant.
Infant is an exaggeration. Yeah. Because what it says in the actual text is that he was a young man. As we'll see, it's a couple verses from where we are right now. It says he and other young men.
So he's only like 13 there? Susanna?
Yeah. So he's 12 or 13. So yeah, I mean, and that shows you too, a 12, 13-year-old with God aside standing up to these people who are much older than him, and much more respected.
Much was bar mitzvah today.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when you quote unquote become.
Yeah. But even so,
But I mean,
for him to be questioning these, the elders of the faith is kind of, lopsided. Okay. So, chapter 1 of Daniel proper. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. Then he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. He carried them into the treasure house of his God. Then the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the chief of his eunuchs, to bring some of the captives of Israel, and some of the royal family, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but handsome, skilled in all wisdom, well-grounded in letters, intelligent and prudent, and who had the ability to serve in the king's house, and whom they might teach the letters and language of the Chaldeans. So that's the order he gives, under which Daniel's taken. So you can see there he's looking for young men who are physically intact, right? But who, that well-grounded in letters basically is saying can read and write. Yeah, can read and write, intelligent, wise, prudent, sharp kids who can learn, who they're going to be able to teach, because they're going to have to learn the Babylonian language. And if they're in the imperial court, Nebuchadnezzar's building an empire, he's going to have representatives of all kinds of people coming to visit him. Right? So he's going to need the people at his court to be able to speak Aramaic, other languages as well, different forms of Aramaic. He's going to have people coming from all the way near to India, to come and see him. Needs people who are going to be able to learn, pick things up quickly. Verse 5, the king also appointed a daily provision for them from the king's table and from the wine he drank, and gave orders to educate them for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Okay, so they start an internship program. Right? You have 3 years. The idea being, this is how they're going to test to see if they pick the right people, basically. They're going to educate them for 3 years. If they seem to be picking things up, then they go before the king. The king will examine them. If he thinks they're ready, he'll take them into his service in the court. If he doesn't, oh well, bring in some more. Bring in some more young men, we'll try again. Okay. So during this 3-year period where they're being trained, okay, the king is graciously right, providing them with food to eat from his own table, meaning they're getting the good stuff. Right? They're not having to go out and forage. They're not having to buy from the farmers in the city around the city of Babylon. This is the best food, the best wine and everything from the king's table. Right? They're eating the way the king and his court eats, even though they're still trainees. Essentially is the idea. Verse 6, now among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, sons of the tribe of Judah. So the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So Daniel and his 3 friends are 4 of these guys who are in training. Right? As we already mentioned, Daniel, whose name meant God is my judge, becomes Belteshazzar. Right? He has a friend Hananiah, which means roughly Yahweh is praised. His name gets changed to Shadrach, which is a form of the name Marduk. Is in there, is one of the Babylonian gods. Mishael, which is a variation on the name Michael, means who is like God. His name gets changed to Meshach, and part of that is the name of the goddess Ishtar. And Azariah, whose name means Yahweh has helped, gets his name changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, who is one of the Assyrian and Babylonian gods. So all that is to say, as we go forward, sometimes we're going to see them referred to by their original Hebrew names. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And sometimes we're going to see them referred to as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like in the Beastie Boys song.
I was thinking of
I figured you did. Like in the Beastie Boys song. They're the same people. Whichever set of names they use at a given point to refer to them, they're the same 3 people. Okay. And they're Daniel's friends. So these 4 are sort of a group that are going through this training program together, who are all from Judah. And just a note, it keeps talking about sort of the eunuch who's in charge of them. This is a common practice. We talked about this once before in terms of Egypt, but the Babylonians did this too. All of the highest level servants, read slaves, but highest level servants of the emperor were all made eunuchs at that time so that they couldn't have children. The idea, there are a couple of reasons. Number one, that way you could trust them to be around the king's harem and nothing would happen. Number two, that way they didn't have any children, So they didn't have anybody they were trying to pass their office on to. And they didn't have any reason, sure, you could try and overthrow the king, but it's not like you could set up a dynasty. Because you don't have any kids. So essentially that was done to them, whether they were interested or not, in order so that they could be trusted with these high positions. You're sort of taking away whatever motivations they might have to betray the king. So you can see a little bit there, just from that and from the way they're being treated, being renamed and this kind of thing. That as far as Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians are concerned, they essentially own these people. Right? They may be getting some nice food, the king's graciousness, because they're going to be doing important jobs, but really they're slaves. Right? They're slaves, and they're going to live and die as he decides. So verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food, nor with the wine he drank. Therefore he entreated the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. This is another kind of gutsy move. What would be the problem with the food and drink that Nebuchadnezzar had?
They pray to a different God.
They prayed to it, exactly. It's not that he ate pork every day. He didn't necessarily eat pork every day. Could have that. Exactly. All of the food, this is something we don't appreciate now in the modern world, because most of us have probably never seen an animal sacrifice. Right? Hopefully none of us have ever participated in one. But we've never seen, but in the ancient world, animal sacrifices were constant in every culture, in every religion, okay? In every city, every day. They were commonplace. Okay? And anthropologically, most scholars agree now that the reason they started was that pretty much every culture has codes against killing. Right? Especially don't kill people. Right? But even animals, they don't want you going out and destroying livestock. Right? And so, in order to maintain their prohibitions against killing, while at the same time having to kill animals to eat, right? They took that act and they made it sacred by getting the gods involved. Right? So you did not have, at this time in history, what we would call a butcher shop, which is a secular establishment that is just butchering animals and preparing meat. That did not exist. Okay? What you had were temples to various gods where at least morning and night, and sometimes continuously throughout the day, depending on the city and the god, etc., they were killing animals and offering them to the gods. Continuously. And the meat from those sacrifices is the meat that was being sold on the street in the meat markets. Right? The kings, in this case, including Nebuchadnezzar, in fine Babylonian tradition, was also a priest. So the food for the king's table was coming from the sacrifices that he offered to the gods. To Marduk, right, and to Bel, and to these other pagan gods. Okay? And so this was seen as part and parcel of the involvement of those gods in the day-to-day life of the city. The gods were seen as sort of part of the family. Like if the city's a big family and the king's the father, right? The gods are part of the family too. They're like the grandparents, right? They're part of it too. So they get their offerings and then we all eat the rest and we're all one big happy family. And we keep the gods happy, we keep the king happy, we keep the people happy. Unity is restored. Well, you could see, if that's the view that they have of this food, why Daniel would look at that and kind of go, I can't really be part of that. Right? I can't really be part of that. I can't sit down and eat a meal with Nebo. Right? I know you like him, Nebuchadnezzar, but I mean, not so much, right? I can't sit down at a dinner with these pagan gods because I only worship one God. Right? And if I'm going to eat something that's been sacrificed, it's got to be something that's been sacrificed to him, or not at all. Right? Or not at all. But now he's in this training, he's essentially a slave, he's in this training program, and now he's going to the eunuch who's in charge and saying, yeah, I think all the food of the kings is tainted. And I won't dirty myself by eating it. Right? Again, this kid. Right? I'm not going to dirty myself by eating the king's food. So verse 9, now the Lord gave Daniel mercy and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. So the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king who ordered your food and drink, lest he see your countenance is gloomy in comparison to the young men your equals. Then you would endanger my head before the king. Okay, so the eunuch, because of God working in his heart, the eunuch kind of likes Daniel, right? And so instead of telling Daniel, shut up and eat the food, kid, right? He says, look, I want to help you out here, but I work for the king, and if he sees you guys tired and listless, when you're going about your training because you're not eating, and he comes and asks me and he finds out I've been letting you not eat, that's my head, right? I don't like you that much, right? So verse 11, so Daniel said to Melzar, whom the chief of the eunuchs appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. After this, let our countenance be observed by you and the countenance of the young men who eat at the king's table. Then deal with your servants as you see fit. So Daniel says, okay, I got a deal for you. Okay? Because I think this will go okay. He says, just bring me and my 3 friends, right? Just bring us vegetables and water, right? So you notice, there isn't some other meat hanging around in Babylon that he can eat, right? It's all been offered to idols. So he says, we're just going to go with vegetables. Just bring us vegetables and water. We'll eat that. You guys eat your food, right? And check and see if we seem tired and listless and all this, right? And then you can decide,
Is them the first vegetarians?
Probably. Yeah, well, yeah. So he says, give us 10 days, right? 10 days. See how we're doing after 10 days. Okay. Verse 14, so he agreed with their proposal and tested them 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, their countenance was observed, and they were more fit and stronger in body than the young men who ate at the king's table. Thus Melzar took away their food and wine and gave them vegetables instead. As for these 4 young men, God gave them understanding and insight in all letters and wisdom, and he gave Daniel understanding in all visions and dreams. Okay, so the test goes so well, they stop giving the other trainees and just start giving them vegetables and water. Also, verse 18, now when their education was completed, the king ordered all the young men to be brought in. Thus the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. So the king spoke with them, and among all of them none were found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they stood before the king, and every saying of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the enchanters and wise men in all his kingdom. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. And we'll see what happens then. A little down the road. Okay, so this, as I said, this first chapter was written in Hebrew, and most people think it was kind of added to the 2 through 7 in Aramaic as a prologue, because basically what it does is it introduces the characters who are going to appear in the stories that are coming up. It sort of sets up the dynamic that's going on. They're in Babylon, they're in the court of the king, so there's this constant tension between how they know they're supposed to live in following the Lord and how they're expected to live now in Babylon. And that tension isn't just like somebody might make fun of them, right, or look down on them. That tension is they may end up getting themselves killed, right, put to death. Okay. And so this is, if you think about when the book was probably collected, if you remember from when we read books of the Maccabees, what was going on around this time. This is when the Greeks had taken over Judea, right? After Alexander the Great had conquered, and then the Seleucid, the Syrian Greeks were in control. And remember, they started that whole program to try to forcibly Hellenize the Jews. That ended up ultimately making it illegal to be circumcised, trying to force them not to follow the food laws. Right? So at the time these stories were put together, they're put together for people who are going through very much the same thing that Daniel and his friends went through. Right? And that is likely what motivated, we need to put these stories of Daniel together and share them with everyone so that they can remember what happened with Daniel and how he stood firm and take courage themselves to stand firm. As we saw in 2 Maccabees with the woman and her 7 sons, for them too it was often a life and death issue. Okay. Let's do chapter 2 here. Now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he had a dream. His spirit was deeply troubled, and his sleep departed from him. So the king gave orders to summon the enchanters, the magicians, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. Thus they came and stood before the king. Does this remind you of anything from earlier? Joseph, remember in Genesis. And so remember, Joseph was given the ability to interpret dreams. And what was that a sign of? That was a sign of the fact that even though his brothers had dumped him down a well and sold him into slavery, right, and now he was in Egypt and far away from his family, that God was still with him. Right? Well, we have something very similar going on here. Right? Daniel's city and country have been destroyed. Right? The temple's been destroyed. He's going to live basically his whole life in exile in Babylon, but that doesn't mean God isn't still with him, right? Despite those things that have happened. And so he gives them the same gift. Verse 3, then the king said to them, the king had a dream. Notice he speaks of himself in the third person. The king had a dream, and my spirit is deeply troubled to know the meaning of the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in the Syrian language. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will tell you its interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the dream has departed from me. If you do not make the dream and its interpretation known to me, you shall be destroyed and your houses will be plundered. But if you do make the dream and its interpretation known to me, you will receive all kinds of gifts from me and be honored by me. Therefore tell me the dream and its interpretation. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar's kind of a hard man. Right? Okay. But, I mean, if you think about it, right, if I tell you what my dream is, I mean, you could come up with something. You know what I mean? That sounds good. Oh, well, that represents this and that. You can make something up. This is kind of hard to fake. Right? This is your real psychic test, right? You tell me what my dream, I've always kind of wanted to do that with a psychic when they say, what's your first name? I say, you tell me,
Well, buy your scotch.
Yeah. So, right? So he's putting the thumb screws through it. And he says, by the way, if it turns out you guys are phonies, all you guys who have been on my payroll all this time, right? It's curtains for you, and your families aren't going to do so well either. Right? I'm going to take back everything I've ever given to you if it turns out you guys are frauds. So they get a little nervous. Verse 7, but they answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will tell you its interpretation. The king answered them, truly, I know you are trying to gain time, because you see that the thing has departed from me. Therefore, if you do not tell me the dream, I will know that you have agreed beforehand to give my dream a false and corrupt interpretation. So before any more time passes by, tell me my dream, then I will know that you can tell me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is no man on earth who can make known the king's dream, and there is no great king or ruler who asks such a thing as this of any enchanter, magician, or Chaldean. question you ask, O king, is difficult and above expectation, for there is no man who can tell the king his dream except the gods, whose dwelling is not with any flesh. Right? So they say, look, come on. No king has to tell him what the dream was. That's not in our job description, right? We're just supposed to interpret it once you tell us. I mean, you're asking too much here. Verse 12, then the king, angry and furious, commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He decreed that the wise men be put to death, and he sought for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Well, Daniel and his friends are included in that category. Right? So he decides, well, they're all phonies. Right? This is all nonsense. So I'm just going to stop playing the fool and get rid of them. Verse 14, then with counsel and intelligence, Daniel spoke to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who went out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He asked him for what reason the bitter decree had come from the king. Then Arioch, the king's official, made the reason known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and entreated the king to give him time, and he would tell the king his dream and its interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They sought mercies from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, that Daniel and his friends might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now notice the detail of what happens here, though. Daniel hears tell, right, that they're going out to kill all the magicians, sorcerers, wise men, magi, etc. He goes to the captain to find out why, right? And he doesn't say, well, spare us, right? He doesn't say, well, right? He goes and says, well, tell the king that I'll take care of it so he doesn't have to kill all these people. So Daniel's not only, it's not this that Daniel's trying to save his own skin. He's trying to save even all these people who don't deserve it. Right? All these people who really were frauds and phonies. So they go and they pray. Because he commits, I'm going to tell you what your dream was. And what it means. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision during the night. After that, Daniel blessed the God of heaven, saying, may God's name be blessed from now on and forever, for wisdom and understanding belong to him. He changes times and seasons. He appoints kings and removes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and insight to those who have skill. He reveals deep and hidden things, and he knows what is in the darkness, and the light is with him. I give thanks and praise to you, O God of my fathers, for you have given me wisdom and power. Now you have made known to me what I asked from you, for you made known the king's vision to me. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king appointed to put to death the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the interpretation to the king. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I found a man among the children of the captivity of Judah who will tell the interpretation to the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, can you tell me the dream I saw and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, the mystery which the king demanded to be told to the king cannot be revealed by wise men, magicians, enchanters, and diviners. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what must come to pass in the last days. Your dream and the visions in your head upon your bed was this. So before we get into the dream, a couple things here. There were questions asked a couple of times as we were going through Jeremiah and Ezekiel Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the way God talked about Nebuchadnezzar, right? That he sort of chosen Nebuchadnezzar to rule over the world at that time. That he'd appointed Nebuchadnezzar as the one to carry out his justice and this kind of thing. A couple times it came up, people asked, well, what is this saying about God's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar? Well, here in the book of Daniel, we're going to see God's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Right? Because he's going to talk to him and relate to him primarily through Daniel here. And so this is part of the introduction. Right? Because remember, Nebuchadnezzar, when he conquered Jerusalem, didn't treat that temple any differently than he treated any other temple. Right? Remember, he went and he plundered it, he took all the gold and the silver, he brought it, he took it to pagan temples, and dedicated it to his gods the way he would anyone else. Right? And remember, at the time, they said basically if you conquered another country, well, that means your gods must be more powerful than their gods, or you wouldn't have won. Right? So the idea that Nebuchadnezzar would care about a conquered country's god, I mean, that's irrelevant to him. Well, Daniel is now going to make it very relevant to him. Right? Because he says, look, none of your sorcerers can tell you this. They told you only the gods could possibly know. He says, well, there is one God who does know, and I can prove it because he told me. And now I'm going to tell you. Okay. Okay. 29. Okay. As for you, O king, thoughts came to you while on your bed as to what must happen after this. And he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what must take place. But as for me, this mystery was not made known to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for the sake of making known the interpretation to the king, that you might know the thoughts of your heart. Okay? So what he's saying is, you were pondering of the future. In this dream, God revealed, the God I'm talking about, right, revealed the future to you. Right? And that's why he told me the interpretation, because he wants you to know about the future, about what's coming. Verse 31, as for you, O king, you saw and beheld one great image. That image was very large and its appearance excellent. It stood before you and its vision was fearful. The word, it keeps using image. It means basically statue. Right? Statue. Think like an idol. Like a big statue, like an idol of a god. The image had a head made of fine gold, and its hands, chest, and arms were made of silver, and its stomach and thighs of copper. Its legs were iron, and its feet were partly iron and partly clay. You saw while a stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and ground them to powder. Then at once the clay, the iron, the copper, the silver, and the gold were like dust from the summer threshing floor, and a great force of wind blew them away, and their place was not to be found. Then the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled all the earth. Okay. So, time for some bad art. Erase our friend from his guard. Okay, so we've got this big statue. We'll give it a curly Babylonian beard. Okay, so it's got this head. Apparently now it's a yard gnome. Anyway, but it's a giant yard gnome, and the head is made of gold. Okay, so we've got a gold head, and then we've got torso and arms that are made of silver. Bronze. Got the legs down here. They're made of iron. And we have the feet. That are made of iron mixed with clay. Okay. This is where the expression "feet of clay" comes from. It's from this vision. Okay, so gold head, silver torso, bronze leggings, iron legs, and then iron and clay feet. Okay, this is what he sees, and then he sees this boulder, right? That gets cut out. Somebody doesn't chisel it out. It gets cut out without hands. This boulder appears, flies, hits the clay feet, right? Smashes them, topples the whole statue crashes to the ground, and then that boulder grows into this giant statue that fills the whole, or grows a giant mountain, fills the whole world. Okay. Now we're assuming in that image the world is flat, right? Because obviously mountain. Yeah, anyway. Okay. So that's the dream he had. Verse 36, this is the dream, and we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given a strong, mighty, and highly regarded kingdom. In every place where the children of men live, as well as the wild animals of the field and the birds of heaven, he put them all in your hand and made you the Lord of them all. You are the head of gold. Okay, so the head of gold up here at the top, that's Nebuchadnezzar, that's the Babylonians. Babylonian Empire. Okay, because God has set him up as the king over this vast kingdom. Verse 39, but after you another kingdom shall arise inferior to yours, then a third kingdom of copper which shall rule over all the earth. Then a fourth kingdom as strong as iron shall arise. And inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and subdues everything, so also it shall break in pieces and subdue all things. Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly clay and partly iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, in the manner you saw the iron mixed with the clay. Whereas the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so part of the kingdom shall be strong and part of it shall be broken. Whereas you saw iron mixed with clay, they shall mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Then in the times of those kings, the God of heaven will raise up a kingdom, and it shall never be destroyed. This kingdom shall not be left to another people, but it will break in pieces and crush all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. Whereas you saw the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, it ground to powder the clay, the iron, the copper, the silver, and the gold. Thus the great God was made known to the king what must come to pass after this. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Okay, so what's he saying? Head is gold, it's Babylonian. It's the Babylonian Empire. It's Nebuchadnezzar's empire that he just set up. After you, another kingdom is going to come that's not going to be as great. That would be who? Persian Empire comes and conquers them. After them, another empire comes and conquers. Who would that be? Greeks, Alexander. After them comes another one that's like iron that crushes the whole world and rides it underneath. Who's that? Right. Right. The Roman Empire. Then what happens? Well, that kingdom remains. Right? The Roman Empire continues on. But what happens to it? Its strength gets mixed with weakness, right? Moral weakness, physical weakness. Okay? So if this is who the pieces are, right? Who do you think the boulder is?
God's kingdom.
Jesus?
God's kingdom.
Right. Well, yeah, Christ. Christ. Why? Not formed by human hands. Right? Not formed by human hands. This boulder. Christ comes when? Roman Empire. Right? Now this is important because we're going to see this whole chain of events play out about 4 different ways in the book of Daniel. And if we pay close attention to each time, it's not only going to tell us in this general sense that Christ is going to come sometime during the Roman Empire, it's going to give us a pretty much the exact date. Just to tease. The next couple of Bible studies. Daniel's going to give us basically the exact date. Okay. And as I pointed out, the latest it was compiled, the Romans weren't even around yet. Okay. But, so we have this boulder representing Christ. What happens? Smashes all this. Smashes all this and establishes a kingdom that then grows and fills the entire earth. Right? So that's the picture. We can see that how this played out in from our perspective in history. This is the future for Nebuchadnezzar. Right? This is the future for Nebuchadnezzar. But now let me ask, why give this dream to Nebuchadnezzar? As I said, a lot of this same information is going to be in the visions at the end of the book of Daniel, that are just visions given to Daniel that were recorded. God could have given us the same thing that way. Here's what I'm going to suggest. He gives this to Daniel. Why did Daniel tell Nebuchadnezzar he had this dream? God wants you to know the future. Right? My God wants you, the one who actually is real and can tell you this, wants you to know this. What? That your empire is great. It's golden. Right? It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But it's not going to last. It's not going to last. Right? It's going to be taken over by somebody else, and they're going to be taken over by somebody else. They're going to be taken over by somebody else. But in the end, God's kingdom is going to last forever. So what is God, through Daniel, calling on Nebuchadnezzar to do?
Repent.
Right. To turn from worshiping these false gods. Right. Who, for example, can't tell him the future. Right? Whereas God can, which proves he's the real God. But turn to worshiping God and humble himself. He's not going to be the king anymore. But he could be a subject. It's better to be a subject in a kingdom that has no end than to be the king of this kingdom that's going to cease to exist and become so much dust. Right? That's what he's calling on him to do. That's what he wants from Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to see as we go forward in the book of Daniel, this relationship between God and Nebuchadnezzar develop as he tries to get that across to Nebuchadnezzar. That's what he's offering Nebuchadnezzar. He's offering Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the greatest empire on earth in his day, the opportunity to instead become a vassal in his kingdom, right, which will last forever. And so we'll see how that all pans out here as we go forward. So just to finish up chapter 2 here. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and worshipped Daniel and commanded sacrifices and drink offerings be made to him. So he doesn't quite get it, right?
Not packed yet.
He gets, obviously, that Daniel has something special going on, but the king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God, he is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, who reveals mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery." Then King Nebuchadnezzar exalted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. He set him over the whole province of Babylon and over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel also petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel was in the king's palace. Okay, so we'll stop here for tonight. That's a good start. Sort of set all the players and what's going on here in the rest of the book and a lot of the themes. Does anybody have any questions before we? Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And we will continue.